Hi folks, I'm Chuck Black. We're doing quokka walkthrough. In this particular session, what we're doing is we're talking about how data, configuration data from places like devices.yaml, file, compliance, services, etc., gets imported into quokka such that it's in the database and such that we can display it here augmented with information that comes live from the device, such as its availability, CPU, memory, response time, etc. So this is the chunk of code that we'll be going through, the referencing the importing of these functions, and then these functions import devices, compliance, services, and workers. So without further ado, let's get started. So we're talking about initialization of quokka, and today we're going to be talking basically about this stuff right here. Before I begin, though, let's briefly review what we've gone through in this initialization. Remember, this init.py is what gets called if you're following the Flask large application model that is provided by Flask. So we have this underscore underscore init underscore underscore module with Python code in it, and this is what gets called whenever you start up Flask running quokka inside of Flask. So the things that we've done in here, we've created our Flask application that's called app. I've imported environment variables. This is mainly for a lot of my monitoring stuff. You can see it has the word monitoring in there. So I'm getting monitoring environment variables that gets passed in. And then I'm going to be actually creating my SQL Alchemy application. That is the thing that's going to allow us to connect to the database. We talked about how important it is to define these views. These are the things that have the decorators inside them that allow Flask to understand what are the endpoints that are going to be called by our quokka running inside Flask. So people will come in at this URL and they'll expect to get something. Likewise for all of these. So that is what all of these views are important for. And we talked about how we defined all of the models. Remember the models, that's what we defined here, the things that you see with capital letters indicating that these are Python classes, and that helps us to define what actually is going to be included in the database table. So this is device. You can see there's a fair amount of stuff in here, a lot of items in the device table. That's what that does, and then I created the database. So this sets up SQL Alchemy to communicate with the database, and it creates the tables if necessary. And now we're going to be talking about this piece right here. So here I have this import statement where I'm importing and letting Python know about my intended usage of import devices, compliance, import services, import workers, and then I actually call them down here. Now before we go into this, I want to go over a couple of things. First of all, you may be looking in this saying, wait a minute, that's kind of weird. I haven't seen that syntax before. What is this import? And then you have parentheses and then a bunch of things on different lines. A couple of things to point out here. Number one, in Python, you can add parentheses around things that they don't really mean anything other than to group them together. And so you can see this in conditional statements. If you have an if statement that is long and goes over multiple lines, you can put parentheses around it, and it keeps you from having to do a backslash to tell Python that I'm continuing this statement on the following line. Remember, I generally don't like that. It's not aesthetically pleasing. It can be confusing. It can be easy to forget, etc. And so that's why this looks this way. Now, why does this look this way? Well, I'm going to show you. In order to do that, I'm going to make a few edits and then talk to you a little bit more about this. So let me be quiet and I'll speed this up in the actual video, and I will continue to explain in just a moment. Okay, so here we see this exact same line. What I've done is I have undone the parentheses and put it all on one line. You may say that this is easier to read. You may see this line here where I actually have told PyCharm that's as long as I want my lines to go, if at all possible. There are PEP8 guidelines in Python that indicate how long your line should be. You can get in flame wars with people about whether it should be at most 80 characters or 100 characters. Some people like me tend to allow it to go a little bit longer than that. But I just want you to notice, number one, this is exactly the same thing. I've no different than what you saw before. Now, how did it end up the way that it did before? Did I do that? I did not do that. Then how did it happen? Well, let me show you something, and this is a little bit important for you to know. There are a number of Python formatters that you can run and that you can install into your IDE, like PyCharm or whatever your IDE of choice might be, that will allow you to automatically format your code in a standard way. If you are like me and you tend to like the way that you format things, then you may chafe at this idea and you may prefer to do things the way that you prefer to do them. On the other hand, I have recently become maybe not an advocate is too strong of a word, but I've become comfortable with the idea of running these formatters that allow the code to be formatted exactly the same way and to look the same no matter who is writing it. If you work in a team with a number of people, then you may be in a situation where there are people with strange habits and you just want some level of conformity, and so you'll do that. So let me show you. I've installed my formatter, and there's like 3 popular ones. One of them is called the black formatter. Now you may be thinking, you probably haven't thought, but my last name is actually Black. This has nothing to do with me. In fact, I don't think it has to do with the name at all. I will tell you that the black formatter is favored by many because it allows you to customize things almost not at all. And so basically you can customize it to work any way that you want, as long as the way that you want it to work is according to the hard and fast rules set by the black formatter. So this keeps you from getting into arguments with people about, okay, well, I want to have spaces after my open parentheses, and I want to have spaces between the variable name and an equal sign, and yada, yada, yada. So a black formatter chooses a style that seems to be popular with most, and it enforces that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this right now, and it's going to run, and there's really not anything for it to do except this one line that we were looking at. So keep your eyes on that import statement that I just modified. So you can see down here it's telling me the black formatter has run. It's all done. It's formatted the file. So that's good to know. And if I look at my statement, it has actually done this for me. If you tend to be a sloppy developer in terms of your coding style and not being precise, then using a formatter can definitely be helpful. Trust me, I've been writing software professionally for 40 years or so, and there are people who might be very good software developers or programmers or coders, but who write things really poorly. And so having something like the black formatter may be useful. Once again, you see these parentheses. What did it do of significance? Nothing, other than it organized it in an aesthetically pleasing and easy to read and understand manner. Another thing I want to point out, I'm spending a lot of time on this import statement, but what I want to make sure that we understand this word right here, I say from, and I'm giving a package name here. The module is going to be in this package APIs. I'm saying import, and it's going to import devices, import compliance, import services, import workers. This import right here is just part of the name. It has nothing to do with this, okay? Those of you who have been around the block a few times are not confused by this. Those of you who are brand new may be looking at this as something new and going, wait a minute, does that mean that I need to name everything import underscore? No, that's not true. We've seen examples of import statements elsewhere. You can see it down here. Import thread manager. We're going to get to that in the next session when we talk about threads. So this has nothing to do with it. Why did I call it import? I called it import because what this is going to do is it's going to go out to our file. It will be a YAML file called devices, and it is going to do what we call importing data from a file into a database. Entirely different thing semantically and syntactically than this import statement, okay? This is just my function name. And one of the reasons that's kind of nice about Python requiring underscores, which I hate because they're hard to type, but one of the nice things is I can double click on something that has an underscore and it highlights the entire thing. That's one of the nice things. If you had a dash in there, then it would not do that. And you may find that in your programming world as you go forward as a software developer. But this is just the name of my function: import devices, import compliance, import services, import workers. Now that I've told Python that I'm going to use these, I can begin and perform these functions, call these functions. So drilling down into what each one of these things do, let's take a quick step back and understand this. You'll notice I say import devices, import compliance, import services, import workers. Okay, and if I go and I look here, I can see here's devices. So I can see, okay, well, I'm going to be importing data about those. I'm going to be importing compliance information. That's good. And then the next one was services. And then the next one was workers. So these are my remote workers. You will learn about remote workers later. I think that the latest VM that's going to be coming out will have remote worker functionality. You can see I don't have any workers running at the moment. So that's what we're looking at. But hang on a minute. Don't we have this important thing called hosts? What's the deal with that? Why am I not having something that says import hosts? And if you think about it for a second, you'll say, oh, well, the reason for that is because I automatically discover hosts. Hosts are not something that I read from a file. Hosts are what I automatically discover. And so I'm configuring devices and reading that in. I'm configuring compliance and reading that in. In fact, if you look over here, you can see compliance over here. You can see devices over there. I'm importing services. There's services. And I'm importing workers. And there's workers. So sure enough, I'm going to be doing that. Now, I'm getting ahead a little bit. My import devices, I'm going to pass in a couple parameters. Now, remember, when we call a function, what is this thing called? It's called a keyword. So I'm passing this by keyword, and my one parameter is file name, and the value of file name is going to be devices.yaml. One thing is file type, and that's going to be YAML. Now, if I drill down into this, I'm going to use my PyCharm trick called Control-B. It's going to take me exactly within this APIs module to import devices. Now, with PyCharm, if you want to know, well, where did it take me? Look up here. These are like your breadcrumbs. I'm in quokka models APIs. So quokka, I'm going to come down here to quokka models, and then APIs. That's the file that I'm at, okay? And I'm at this file, I'm at this function called import devices. So let's go through this briefly. I believe we'll spend more time later on, but I just want you to get the idea during initialization of what we're doing. Remember, we have the two parameters, file name and file type. So what I'm going to do is, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go out to my devices table in the database, and I'm going to delete the existing devices. Now, we could have design discussions, and we probably would if this was a real product. Do you want to delete devices that have already been discovered? I can tell you this. What I'm doing is I'm deleting the actual devices table, but what I'm not deleting is the data associated with it. Now, I haven't been running this for a while. You can see there's a huge gap. I think I saved this overnight, so it looks kind of weird, but you can see that I do have some amount of data. I've kept data around for my devices, so I'm keeping the data, but I'm refreshing the information. Now, the further thing that you might ask is, well, wait a minute, doesn't that mean that you need to make sure that you keep the same identifiers or something in your YAML file? And the answer to that is yes, this is an important thing. So for those of you that are following along and understand quokka enough, this identifier, you do want to be very careful about mucking around with this. And if you want to muck around with it and change the IDs and instead of just using new ones, then what you probably want to do is maybe get rid of the database. So we could do that, drop database and create database. There's also functionality that I've put into quokka where you can come and you can say reset devices, reset hosts, reset services, events, capture, etc. So you can do all of those things. At least the last time I ran them, they did seem to work. So that's the general idea of what's going on here. Let's go back to where I was and look at this import devices code. So the first thing I do is I go through, and this syntax, we're going to cover it more later. Like I say, I'm not intending to go into every detail of SQL Alchemy, but trust me, DB is the database connection that we set up. Session is this particular session connectivity to that database. So the way that SQL Alchemy works is there's going to be something called a session that allows me to do things to the database. I'm going to be doing a query. You may have heard that word before in the context of databases. That means I'm going to be asking the database service to get me a bunch of records or rows from that table, and I'm not specifying any filter whatsoever. And the table that I want it to get it from is device, and so it's going to return all of the devices, and SQL Alchemy makes it very nice. I can just do .delete, and it's going to delete all of the devices in the database. Then I'm going to read them in. And this is some of my syntax. In the Python 52 weeks, we will go into files. I haven't recorded that stuff yet. I think I've recorded up to week 14, 16, something like that. But we'll be getting there soon. But what this is saying is I want you to go to this location, quokka data, and then the file name. And remember, the file name that we passed in was devices.yaml. That's this thing right there. Now I'm going to say I want you to open it for reading, and I, within my code, refer to it as import file. So this variable name that I'm going to use later on, I want you to have that be pointing at this file that I've opened. And so import file is going to be my variable name. And you can see it's highlighted here nicely. I'm going to be reading in the data from it. Now what I'm doing is I'm saying if it's a JSON file, then I'm going to, and again, this is a situation where I've kind of overloaded the statement with a whole bunch of stuff, or maybe packed in a bunch of stuff is a better way to put it. The first thing that I'm doing, we start from the inside. I'm taking import file, which is this file, my devices.yaml file. I want you to read it, and the read built-in function for files that Python provides will read the entire text file. And it reads the entire text file, and the next thing it's going to do is it's going to do a JSON.loads. And you'll notice that I'm an idiot because I'm talking about JSON when actually this is a YAML file, okay? So I'm an idiot. I admit it. My wife will second and third that probably. This is where I should be looking because the file type is going to be YAML, not JSON. All right, you with me there? So we're going to be doing import file .read, and we're going to read it in. This information is exactly the same. The only difference is here I'm doing JSON load, and if it's a YAML file, then I'm doing YAML safe load. I used to do load S for YAML, but it has been found to be unsafe, so they created a new function called safe load in the YAML package, and so I'm doing a safe load of devices. What I end up with at the end of that is a Python data structure that has been created out of that YAML information. So it takes this YAML information and it changes it into lists, dictionaries, etc., and it will allow me to deal with it. And what I'm going to do then, and I'm not going to go into this, well, I'll let you get a peek at it. I'm going to say set devices. What do you suppose that does? It's a function that I wrote that will set these devices that I've just read. See this thing right here? It's going to take that and it's going to write it to the database. I'm going to do Control B. Here's my set devices functionality. And so I'm going to go through here, and for every one of the devices in there, I am going to either I'm gonna look for the actual device ID to see if I found it or not. And then what I'm going to end up doing at the end of this, and we're not going to go into this in great detail right now, I'm going to end up adding that item to the database. And this syntax right here, I will be going over so that you understand exactly what it is that this is doing. But when I'm done with that, for all of the devices, I do a db.session.commit, and it writes that out to the database. Now I'm going to do this for devices, for my compliance data, for my services data, and for my worker data. So the stuff that you see in here is going to be what I have actually read in, at least at the beginning. Now obviously status, I'm going to be updating that. I'm going to be updating the CPU, the memory, the response time, and the last checked. For compliance, I'm going to be updating the software version when I check that, and the configuration and the last checked. For services, I'm going to continually be going out and I'm going to be finding the response time and the availability. And then for workers, which is another table, I am maintaining their status, and this is what it will look like when I read it in. And once I start some workers running, then we will see some of this go green. In fact, I'm going to do that right now. So you can see that I've started the worker running. If I go back here and look at quokka correctly, when this updates, it will turn green. If I did refresh workers, then it would re-get the data from the database. These are this is my local host I'm running, and this will be, yeah, sure enough, those are now green. I've updated the database. The CPU utilization 38, memory at 68. Just for grins, let me go over here and let's see if CPU utilization, yeah, I can see that being around 38. And the memory, what did I say, 68? Yeah, memory, I'm using a lot of memory, so I'm at 68% of my 5 gig of RAM. So, but I'm digressing. Let me rein myself back in. This is what I have done at this beginning point. I'm importing devices from the file, compliance, services, workers, and within those I'm deleting the old and creating the new. I mentioned that I'm not getting rid of the status data. I recently created a DB maintenance that goes through and it trims the status files so that they don't grow forever. And I think it may or may not trim events after 3 months or something like that. But that is what we do with devices, compliance, services, and workers during this initialization phase. Hopefully that's making sense to you and you have a general idea of what it is that we do, why we didn't do hosts, of course, because we're going to discover those. And as we go through starting of our threads at a next lesson, then you'll understand a little bit more how that works as well. Okay, so let's quickly review what we talked about. Basically, we were talking about this stuff right here, which was importing of information from these files over here, the configuration files, and storing it in our database. We did devices, compliance services, workers. We noted that we didn't do hosts because hosts are automatically discovered. If I was to drill down into services, which we haven't done before, you will see that in services, as with the others, we delete what was there before in that particular table, and then we read them in, and we do things like logging events. If there's an existing ID already, we know there's a problem. We looked a little bit at creating our database object and writing it and committing it. We're going to go through that later on as we understand more details about SQL alchemy. So that is what we're doing here. This is another step in the process of initiating quokka when it gets up and running. And so yeah, hopefully that gives you a general idea about what is going on. We're going to look at threads next. Hope it's helpful.